A World History of Christianity, Chapter 10, Part 2, page 383. Although not explicitly stated in missionary accounts, successful evangelization had from the beginning depended upon the generous assistance of Chinese Christians. The first three prominent Christian scholar officials, Paul Su, Leo Li, and Michael Yang, not only supported and defended the Western priests, they also funded flourishing churches in their native Jiangnan localities. Thus, Zikawei, the estate of the Su family outside the old city of Shanghai, became the major Jesuit mission station in China and still is the center of Christian life in the Shanghai region. Later on, other Chinese Christian literati collaborated in important translation projects, wrote on Christian theology as they understood it, and sought to mediate between the contending European parties in the rights controversy, correcting certain misconceptions concerning Chinese rights, and advocating the coexistence of Confucianism and Christianity. At the same time, most Catholic missionaries came to recognize the importance of training a native clergy, given the size of the country and the many social and linguistic problems for foreign priests. Luo Wenzhou, Gregorio Lopez, 1611 through 91, has the distinction of being the first Chinese priest. A native of Fujian province, he entered the Dominican order and was ordained in Manila in 1654. He was subsequently consecrated Bishop of Nanjing, but till the 20th century remained the only Chinese to hold an episcopal office. Bishop Luo in turn ordained the first Chinese priests on Chinese soil on 1st August 1688. Other Chinese clerics were trained in Macau by the Jesuits, in Manila by the Dominicans, and in the Seminary General in Siam by the Paris missionaries. The propaganda missionary Mateo Ripa, 1682 through 1746, founded the College of the Holy Family in Naples in 1732 for the purpose of training Chinese secular clergy. In time, more native clergy would receive training in China itself. All of these Chinese priests pursued their apostolic work during the periods of persecution in the 18th century, but their number remained rather small. Thus we find that the remarkable Li Andreas Li, 1693 through 1774, who had been trained at the MEP Seminary General in Siam, was the only priest in the large province of Sichuan to minister to the many Christian communities in the late 1740s. Given the nature of the evangelistic task and the paucity of clergy, the mission enterprise had to rely on various kinds of lay personnel to manage church affairs, conduct religious services and evangelization, instruct the young, and arrange the priests' all too infrequent clandestine visits to their communities, catechists, congregational leaders, and women known as virgins, since Chinese Moors made it impossible for priests to establish direct contact with the often pivotal female elements in particular households. Christian women became a vital element in the apostolate from the beginning of the missionary enterprise in China. Certain single lay women consecrated their lives to the service of God and the mission. These so-called Chinese virgins, while taking their vows, continued to live with their families, where they taught the women and children, and during times of persecution became the true pillars of the faith within the community. While printed instructions were circulated in some parts of China to instruct local lay leaders of parishes deprived of their priests as to how to conduct church affairs and propagate Catholicism, many Christian congregations relied on the accumulated body of religious knowledge, catechisms, songs, biblical stories, or simply local Christian tradition to preserve the faith. Nevertheless, some congregations must have succumbed to the synchronistic pressures of local folk religion or indigenous sectarianism. Yet, in spite of the many vexations and periodic persecutions, some 200,000 Christians are said to have existed nationwide in scattered communities at the beginning of the 19th century. These congregations of old Christians formed the vital base from which the next phase of Christian expansion in China would be launched. The origins of the church in Vietnam. Although there had been some earlier missionary contacts, a more fruitful Christianizing effort started in Vietnam in 1624 with the arrival at the FIFO mission of the French Jesuit Alexandre de Rhodes, 1591 through 1660. He was a gifted linguist, producing the first catechism in the Vietnamese language. It was written in vernacular Vietnamese, in the Latin alphabet. Between 1627 and his expulsion in 1630, Rhodes was active in Tonkin, the northern part of Vietnam, controlled by the Trinh. Here he made his greatest contribution to the Vietnamese church by establishing the Domus Dei, an organization of seminary-trained catechists. These celibate laymen also received elementary medical training and were encouraged to work in the villages. In fact, the organization was based on an existing Buddhist institution, evidence of Rhodes' willingness following the examples set by Valignano and Ricci to adapt to established indigenous religious customs and practices. In local communities, there was already a high regard for celibacy and a common belief that illness was due to possession by evil spirits. Many traditional indigenous religious specialists who became catechists often brought their followers into the church en masse. During a second sojourn in Vietnam from 1640, Alexander de Rhodes applied the same methods in the Nguyen territories in the south, albeit with less success. In 1645, he was forced to abandon the work in Vietnam as both the Nguyen and Trinh factions had become apprehensive about Christianity. Still, parts of the country continued to witness remarkable Christian growth in spite of the very limited number of European clergy. In 1658, the whole of Vietnam was said to have some 300,000 Catholics, but only 2 priests. It was the lay leadership of the Domus Dei, which was primarily responsible for this rapid growth and survival of the Vietnamese church. In consequence of this remarkable expansion, Father de Rhodes, upon his return to Europe from the East in 1649, sought to gain approval for the formation of a strong native clergy as necessary for the promotion of Catholicism. To this end, he played a significant role in the foundation of the Foreign Mission Society of Paris in 1659. In part intended to undermine the Portuguese and Spanish patronage monopolies, this new society of secular priests enjoyed the support of the French church, French mercantile interests, and the court of Louis XIV. From the outset, the newly appointed French vicars apostolic Pierre Lambert de la Motte, MEP, 1624 through 79, and François Malou, MEP, 1626 through 84, were interested in Southeast Asia as a whole, in part because the Portuguese authorities prevented French priests from entering China through Macau. In 1666, the MEP opened a central seminary in Ayutthaya, the capital of Siam, to prepare Chinese, Vietnamese, and other East Asians for the priesthood. While the MEP priests continued to follow the Jesuit policy of promoting the formation of a native clergy, these bearers and representatives of Catholicism as well as French culture were less willing to practice accommodation in Vietnam. On the contrary, in 1672, the Synod of Touraine forbade Catholics to participate in ceremonies revering Confucius, thus creating a major obstacle to the conversion of significant sections of Vietnam's Confucian elite. Moreover, this decision could not but increase the animosity toward Christianity of the Vietnamese authorities in both the Trinh and Nguyen areas, culminating in the expulsion of the missionaries in 1750. Although the mixture of French political, commercial, and religious activities promoted in Southeast Asia since the 1660s could not be sustained at this time, it laid the foundations for more aggressive French imperialist and missionary penetration of Vietnam in the 19th century. Indeed, at the end of the 18th century, some French priests were able to enter the country once more by acting as intermediaries in military affairs. Thus, Bishop Pierre Pignou de Beauhain, MEP, died 1799, assisted Nguyen Anh in his ultimately successful effort to reunite Vietnam. Nguyen Anh, who in 1802 proclaimed himself emperor under the reign title Gia Long, subsequently tolerated the presence of Christian communities as a debt of gratitude. In spite of periodic persecutions, the Catholic Church was more successful in Vietnam at this time than in any other part of Asia except the Philippines. This is primarily due to the important contribution and perseverance of native Christians, led by indigenous clergy and a strong lay leadership. 1800 through 1945. In the course of the 19th century, the missionary enterprise, in which Catholics had now to compete with Protestants, became increasingly associated with expanding Western colonialism and imperialism. However, at the beginning of the 19th century, much of East and Southeast Asia was still beyond the reach of any European power. Only Penang, Malacca, Java, some of the Maluku, and the northern part of the Philippines could really be said to be under direct foreign control. However, by the early 20th century, virtually all of Southeast Asia had at least been nominally integrated into the colonial order, as the Dutch extended their control over the Indonesian islands while the British absorbed Burma and Malaya in several stages, and the French took possession of Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Still, colonial domination remained rather uneven and never complete. For instance, a number of the outer regions under nominal Dutch sovereignty were in reality controlled by overseas Chinese economic interests. Although none of the East Asian states were formally integrated into Western colonial empires, in the middle of the 19th century, China and Japan, and later Korea also, were forced to accept treaty settlements that entailed foreign penetration of hitherto relatively closed societies. Zealous missionaries, products of European and American revival movements, were quick to take advantage of the new opportunities created by Western imperialism. The Church, colonialism, and nationalism in Southeast Asia. As we have seen, only the Philippines had largely been converted to Christianity by 1800. Elsewhere, the foreign evangelists were struggling to overcome Muslim resistance in Malaya and parts of Indonesia, and Theravada Buddhist opposition in Burma and Thailand. But it was developments in Vietnam that demonstrated a new, more aggressive side of Christian expansion. Initially, prospects looked rather better here for the influence of Pignou de Beauhain and his French military associates in helping to establish the Nguyen dynasty of the Gia Long Emperor in the 1790s, carried over into the second decade of the 1800s. The emperor respected the Catholic faith espoused by his French friends and permitted the unimpeded functioning of the missionaries. These were mainly Spanish friars in the north, Tonkin, and French priests in the south, Annam and Cochin China. There were an estimated 300,000 Christians in Tonkin and some 60,000 in Cochin, China by 1820. However, after Jia Long's death, the new ruler, dominated by conservative Confucianists and patriotic elements, inaugurated in 1825 a policy of harassment of missionaries and converts. The court at Hue was particularly alarmed by the arrival of new French missionaries in the 1820s, representatives of the vigorous revival which characterized the post-Napoleonic period in Europe and which found expression in the daring missionary penetration of various countries in Asia. The missionaries accepted personal risks and sacrifices, were contemptuous of any political barriers imposed, and were also oblivious to the feeling of local alarm which their aggressive actions might arouse. It is therefore not surprising that persecutions of Christians became more violent in Vietnam after 1833, developing into a feud between King Minh Mang and French missionary leaders, who requested the aid of French naval vessels visiting Eastern Asia. In response, Minh Mang ordered all foreign priests to assemble at the capital, where they were held as virtual prisoners. Some escaped, but 7 French and 3 Spanish missionaries were killed between 1833 and 1840. Nevertheless, these also were the years of the rapid expansion of French evangelistic activity in Vietnam. Catholic missionaries were able to enter Tonkin secretly and quite easily from Macau. By encouraging greater French naval intervention, these priests argued that it would encourage disaffected partisans of the old Le dynasty to challenge the established rulers. Once in power, the missionaries asserted the new rulers would grant more missionary concessions as well as the desired naval base for France. However, the French took little concrete action at this time, and conditions deteriorated for foreign missionaries and indigenous Catholics. It was not until the reign of Napoleon III that the concerted clerical campaign succeeded in obtaining the armed intervention of France in Vietnam. The French emperor decided to take advantage of French participation in the Second Opium War in China, 1856 through 60, to start the process of territorial acquisition in Vietnam, which was completed in 1885. Henceforth, Vietnamese Catholicism came to be associated with French colonialism. As Dutch control and influence expanded in what is now Indonesia in the 17th and 18th centuries, missionary activities as such were not encouraged. Indeed, such Christianizing efforts as had been undertaken were essentially confined to the conversion of indigenous Catholics to Protestantism, if need be by force. However, since Christians were favored over non-Christians in Dutch East India Company service, some non-Muslims had found it useful to join the Protestant Church. After 1800, when evangelization was no longer discouraged by the Dutch authorities, active Protestant missionary work commenced amongst the non-Islamic peoples, and to a lesser extent among nominal Muslims. Thus, a more permanent work was initiated in eastern Java in 1814 by affiliates of the London Missionary Society. The Rhenish Missionary Society worked from 1836 in South Borneo and from 1862 among the Toba Bataks in northern Sumatra and on Nias, where in time the largest Indonesian Protestant church, the Huria Kristen Batak Protestant, was to emerge. The Indische Kerk, the popular name of the Protestantische Kerk in Netherlandish Indie, which originally had been the official church of the Dutch East India Company, from around 1900 began substantial missionary activity in central Sulawesi, Maluku, and the Timor archipelago. But It remained a kind of state church, since its ministers and lay officials continued to be paid as government servants. In view of the strong link with the colonial system, this was to have disastrous consequences for them during the Japanese occupation 1942 through 45. Roman Catholic missions became possible again in the Dutch East Indies only after 1807, but at first remained limited to the pastoral care of European Catholics. However, in time, a number of societies were able to resume mission work, especially amongst the surviving congregations in Maluku, northern Sulawesi, Solar Flores, and the Dutch part of Timor. In the fiercely Islamic parts of the Indonesian archipelago, on the other hand, opposition to the Dutch rulers and their religion remained strong, as indicated by the fanatical resistance of Aceh in northern Sumatra in a war which started in 1873. The Muslim populations of the Malay Peninsula proved equally unresponsive. Here, the Christianizing effort remained largely confined to the British possessions of Malacca, Penang, and Singapore, where evangelistic work among the Chinese migrant communities became an important part of the missionary enterprise. In Siam and the Burmese kingdoms of Ava and Pegu, relatively little progress was made. In particular, the Protestant version of Christianity proved too alien in the heartland of Theravada Buddhism and almost impossible to reconcile with traditional, social, and religious norms and practices. The only important Christian missionary impact was achieved among non-Buddhist minority groups such as the Karens and Kachins. While traditional political and cultural opposition had accompanied the extension of European colonialism, in time an emerging national consciousness produced new forms of resistance. These forces developed quite early in the Philippines, the most Christianized colonial possession in Asia. After 1800, the Spanish began to experience increasing political and social unrest, especially in areas where the reactionary regular clergy had control over most of the land. Moreover, these friars, Augustinian Eremites, Franciscans, and Dominicans, formed the most reliable pillar of Spanish rule in the Philippines. Indebted peasants came into conflict with the friars over access to undeveloped land. Although passivity more often than not was the norm, from time to time rustic reaction became violent. Such belligerent responses frequently developed strong millenarian dimensions, in which magic played a powerful part, including the belief in charms, amulets, and symbols of invulnerability deriving from pre-Spanish traditions but modified by popular Catholicism. While much of the rural unrest remained traditional in character, some of the millenarian anti-friar movements in central Luzon were colored by patriotic sentiments. They were led by Filipino clergy who felt discriminated against in parish appointments, which far too often went to regular clergy from Spain. Thus, Apolinario de la Cruz, a frustrated Filipino layman who had been refused membership in a religious order in 1841, transformed what had originally been a church-approved confraternity, the Confradia de San Jose, into a separate organization. It became known as the Colorom movement, in which Spaniards and mestizos were explicitly denied membership. Although essentially a social movement, it did develop certain heterodox religious ideas. Consequently, when Apolinario was captured, he was horribly dismembered, presumably to disprove his supernatural pretensions. The survivors went into the mountains and there founded their New Jerusalem. Christian names and terminology were used by the rebels, but the doctrines and rites were of pre-Spanish origin. The important contribution of native priests to the rise of Filipino nationalism became particularly evident in a schismatic religious movement led by Father Gregorio Aglipe, who had been excommunicated in the 1890s because of his condemnation of foreign domination of the Philippine Church. Emilio Aguinaldo, leader of Katipunan, Sons of the People, made him Vicar General of the Nationalist Army, and after the break with Rome in 1902, he assumed the role of Supreme Bishop of the new Philippine Independent Church. This new religious organization enlisted only Filipinos as clergy, permitted them to marry, conducted services in the local dialects, and itself participated actively in national political affairs. It should be stated, though, that the great majority of Filipino Catholics remained loyal to the Orthodox Catholic faith. Under American rule, the dominant friar landholdings were dissolved and clerical influence in government was eliminated. At the same time, health and educational facilities were much improved. It should also be noted that American imperialist expansion was enthusiastically supported and taken advantage of by many American Protestant missionaries who finally saw a chance to commence evangelistic work in the Philippines after 1900. Although conversion to Christianity often implied collaboration in colonial rule, the emerging indigenous Protestant churches could also become a focus of resistance to foreign secular and religious domination. The movements by the Javanese mystics Paulus Tosari and Sadrak in central Java were the earliest and most remarkable examples of indigenous use of Christianity to resist Dutch dominance in the 19th century. But it was not until the 1930s that a number of autonomous churches emerged in various parts of Indonesia, such as the Batak Church in 1930, the Christian Church of East Java in 1931, the Pasundan Church in West Java, the Minahasa Church in 1934, the Malukan Church in 1935. The Dutch missionary theologian Hendrik Kramer deserves some of the credit, for he recognized the impact of the growing Indonesian nationalism on native Christians and was instrumental in effecting a change of attitude among missionaries. As he reminded the delegates to the 1938 Tambaran Conference of the International Missionary Council, the younger churches are the fruit of missionary labor, not the possession of mission societies. However, as the history of the Batak Church in northern Sumatra indicates, the organization of autonomous churches had more to do with the indigenous Christians' desire to rid themselves of the tight grip of missionary control than with the early stirrings of a national consciousness. Since Christianity was the faith of the colonial rulers, it was in any case virtually impossible for native Christians to be actively involved in the early national independence struggles, except of course in the Philippines. It was the Japanese wartime occupation of Southeast Asia which gave local Christians the opportunity to assume prominent leadership positions and manage church affairs while the Europeans were interned or expelled. From mission to church in modern China. Following the Napoleonic Wars, renewed Catholic, as well as the emerging Protestant, interest in the West in missions brought about the gradual expansion of the missionary enterprise in the Middle Kingdom during the first 4 decades of the 19th century. Indeed, China would become the primary focus of the Western missionary movement in East Asia, and a major object of the hopes of Christians around the world. However, the Chinese people remained suspicious of and hostile toward Christianity. Probably few missionaries in the 19th century realized the depth and strength of the Chinese state's historical obsession with preserving orthodoxy, and the resulting immense suspicion of Christianity as a heterodox doctrine that would undermine the traditional social order. Thus, missionary activities in the interior of China continued to be illegal and precarious. Nevertheless, the clandestine operations saw the reassembly of scattered surviving Christian congregations, and the reorganization of Catholic ecclesiastical territories, involving the final replacement of the Padroado arrangement with vicariates apostolic, controlled by the Congregation of Propaganda Fide in Rome. The reintegration of Chinese Catholics into the expanding missionary enterprise was not achieved without resistance. There are some indications that local communities and their lay leaders were loath to give up the autonomy they had achieved as a result of infrequent or non-existent priestly supervision. Certainly in the Shanghai area, Vicariate Apostolic of Jiangnan, there was considerable resistance to the reassertion of foreign missionary power. In particular, the Huizhang, having become accustomed to complete financial autonomy, clashed with the missionaries over the question of local financial control. The newly arrived missionaries also objected to the ecclesiastical power of women, especially the virgins' liturgical and religious role in the local community. They appreciated their dedication, but also considered them a source of scandal. Thus, Pierre Lavieser, C.M., wrote in 1840 that he was endeavoring to eliminate night visits by the virgins and to compel them to show less familiarity with their relatives and neighbors. In the prefectural city of Songjiang, a confrontation between missionaries and Chinese arose over virgins' participation in the liturgy. The latter were accustomed to chanting prayers in Chinese during Mass. When Bishop Ludovico de Bisi ordered the prayers to be recited by the entire congregation, men and women alternately, a storm of protest broke out, since such public conversation between men and women offended Chinese moral sensibilities. After the Jesuits had taken charge of the Jiangnan mission in the 1840s, they determined to solve these problems by regularizing the Virgin's life. Thus, in 1869, a group of French nuns founded a native Chinese congregation, the Association of the Presentation of the Blessed Virgin, Presentadines. The new congregation, as well as those subsequently established in other parts of the country, was intended to replace the virgins. They were placed under the authority of the mission superior, which contributed to greater foreign ecclesiastical control. However, it proved impossible to eliminate the ancient institution of virgins entirely, and thus a degree of local autonomy was preserved. The privileged status Christians gained as a result of the so-called unequal treaties probably more than made up for the loss of autonomy. Certainly, proselytization in China was greatly facilitated. Under the treaty settlements of 1842 through 44, following the First Opium War, 1839 through 42, the old 1724 prohibition against belief in Christianity was lifted. In addition, the French special envoy Théodose de Langrune obtained an imperial edict in 1846 that provided for the return to the Christians of certain church properties of the pre-1724 era. More important concessions were gained by the missionaries in the treaties of 1858 through 60. These permitted travel and the propagation of Christianity anywhere in the interior of China. Particularly noteworthy here is the French treaty, especially the notorious Article 6, containing surreptitiously inserted additional rights in the Chinese version of the 1860 Beijing Convention, permitting the purchase of land and erection of buildings anywhere, not just in the designated treaty port cities, and associated agreements which exempted Christians from contributing to communal endeavors that were thought to have a superstitious component. Most importantly, the French government assumed a religious protectorate over all Catholics in the Qing Empire, including foreign missionaries regardless of nationality, as well as Chinese converts. Thus, the physical expansion of the Christian presence was delimited by treaties, foreign diplomatic intervention, and from time to time threatened or actual military action. The emergence of muscular Christianity in China coincided with the Taiping Rebellion, 1851 through 64, against the alien Manchu dynasty, one of the most devastating civil wars in human history. The Qing state considered the Taipings to be dangerous ideological heretics. Moreover, in the eyes of government officials and the gentry class, the Taipings were Christians. Perhaps they are best understood as a Chinese heterodox millenarian sect with a syncretic Christian veneer derived from limited contact with Protestant missionaries, at best a premature and misguided example of indigenous Christianity. What is important is that China's ruling class identified the Taipings with Christianity, thereby intensifying opposition to the foreign religion, which certainly made it more difficult for Western missionaries to enter the country and the Chinese church to flourish. The presence of Protestant evangelists had in fact added a new dimension. Prior to the treaties, Robert Morrison of the London Missionary Society, who had arrived in 1807, and the handful or so of subsequent early missionary arrivals, were confined to a precarious existence in Macau and seasonal residence in Guangzhou or Canton. In both locations, their religious activities were severely restricted. In the 1830s, the Prussian Lutheran independent missionary Karl Friedrich August Gutzlaff, 1803 through 51, made several attempts to gain direct access to the Middle Kingdom. His reckless operations in foreign ships smuggling opium to points along the Chinese coast have been especially severely criticized. But essentially all missionaries, Protestant as well as Catholic, had to depend on the opium connection. Many traveled out to China in ships carrying opium. Their funds were remitted via opium traders, and their charitable or educational work relied on donations from resident Western firms connected with the opium trade. Certainly in the minds of many Chinese, opium and Christianity were closely associated. As a result of the first treaty settlements, the Protestant missionaries, mostly of American and British nationality, had better opportunities to establish themselves in the 5 treaty ports and Hong Kong. After 1860, missions were established in all the new coastal and riverine treaty ports, and from there began to spread into the interior. The missionary presence grew rapidly in size and complexity. By 1900, there were over 2,000 foreign Protestant missionaries in China. The main point here, too, is that all these developments, as well as the status and activities of the increasing numbers of Chinese who converted to Christianity, were ultimately dependent on the treaties imposed by the foreigners on the Qing state, and therefore had political implications. Whereas Protestant missionaries, with the exception of Hudson Taylor's interdenominational and international China Inland Mission, established themselves primarily in cities and from there itinerated in the surrounding villages. The returning Roman Catholic priests reestablished control over the surviving rural congregations and worked and lived among the ordinary peasants. In time, they too would reclaim former urban church premises and erect major residences and imposing structures in the cities of China, essentially for reasons of prestige and security. But a large number of European priests continued to reside at many of the growing number of rural stations. Indeed, in the 19th century, conversion to Christianity remained overwhelmingly a rural phenomenon. In the increasingly unstable social situation, especially after the devastating mid-century rebellions, some groups within rural communities became amenable to mass conversion. It is difficult to know whether and to what extent spiritual motivations came into play. Certainly individual seekers after truth entered the church for religious reasons. There are also many documented cases of indigenous heterodox sectarian groups who were attracted by the Christian message of salvation in an uncertain world. Nevertheless, perhaps in the majority of cases, adherence to the Catholic Church provided a basis for social integration and self-protection in the competition for survival and resource control in rural China, where groups had to rely on their own cohesiveness and strength. Clearly, some of the individuals and families who became Christians in this chaotic social situation were able directly or indirectly to use the influence of foreign missionaries to increase their leverage in local society. The competition for scarce resources naturally gave rise to violent conflict. There are hundreds of documented cases of disputes involving local Christians in the late 19th century. The refusal of Christians to pay taxes and contributions to heathen temple upkeep and village theatricals, lawsuits between Christians and non-Christians, problems over property rights, intralineage or interlineage disputes. Since Catholic missionaries could rely on the often willing support of the French government, their effective intervention not only created powerful new soliditaries or reinforced existing ones, but made the church attractive to other groups as well. The group identity of Christians helped them protect their interests at the expense of their adversaries. Anti-Christian feeling derived from other sources as well. In spite of the continuous growth of rural Christianity, its adherents amounted to only a fraction of 1% of the total population of China. Nevertheless, its increasingly powerful social and political role was seen as harmful by both rural elites and common people. It undermined long-established traditions, thereby provoking the anger of non-Christians in the locality. Conflict occurred also in urban settings. Here missionaries had an even greater political and cultural impact. It should be noted that missionaries saw themselves as engaging in a civilizing mission, as part of the general expansion of Western domination. The foreign missionaries were a profound threat to the local culture and social hegemony and status monopoly of the gentry class. Indeed, much more, for with their status as literate teachers and having access to political authorities, and thus the ability to protect their followers, missionaries encroached on the specifically political prerogatives of the gentry. Protestants especially set up schools for boys and girls, hospitals, and printing presses, producing both secular and religious works. Chinese women found employment in schools and hospitals or worked as Bible women. Implacable gentry hostility to missionaries and Christianity, and the prominent gentry role in fomenting and leading anti-Christian violence is therefore not difficult to understand. It was they who generated fear and suspicion, fed by rumors and inflammatory placards that from time to time burst into anti-Christian violence. These increasingly endemic local tensions reached a climax in the intensely xenophobic Boxer Uprising of 1900, in which many missionaries and thousands of Christians were killed. The disastrous Summer Madness of 1900 brought about significant changes in China's relations with the West. Traditional anti-Christian sentiments subsided significantly, and missionaries and Christians were able to play a more constructive role in subsequent Chinese reform efforts. On the Protestant side, Christianity became much more diverse than it had been before 1900. A great variety of new Christian mission groups established themselves, some of them in theology or practice quite new, such as Pentecostals or Adventists. Many more independent or faith missionaries came to China. These were not part of the traditional mission societies. Meanwhile, those established mission societies who had not only churches, but other institutions, such as schools or hospitals, also grew substantially. By 1925, there were over 8,000 foreign Protestant missionaries in China, nearly 4 times as many as in 1900. A portion of the Protestant mission community attempted, with some success, to overcome their traditional denominational divisions and to promote a unified Protestant church. But other missionaries refused to participate in this trend and kept their activities and organizations separate. One reason for this was the theological split between evangelicals and social reformers. After the First World War, this split became quite severe and bitter, and took on the term conservative and modernist to designate its two theological poles. As a result of the influx of new mission groups and ideological differences, the Protestant mission bodies tended to be less united by the 1920s than they had been in the 1890s. As another important development, the contours of an emerging Chinese Christianity began to take shape after 1900, as indicated by the growth of independent Chinese Protestant forces both inside and outside the established mission churches. Towards the end of the 19th century, some foreign missionaries, as well as Chinese Christian leaders, had already begun to promote the three self principle. That is to say, Chinese Christians would be responsible for self-management, self-support, and self-propagation in the churches. From the early 1910s and the formation of the China Continuation Committee of the Edinburgh Conference of 1910, this goal was pursued gradually, reaching its high point in the National Christian Conference of 1922. Out of this historic meeting came the Interdenominational Church of Christ in China, a Sino-foreign body with a significant degree of Chinese leadership and responsibility. The National Christian Council, a Protestant coordinating and liaison body, was also a product of this period. However, these changes did not really constitute a great deal of movement toward an authentically independent or indigenous Chinese church. Attitudes of paternalism remained strong among foreign missionaries, and the power of foreign financial subsidy remained a potent, if usually an implicit, factor in most Christian organizations. A rather more independent sector of Chinese Protestantism also came into being in the period between 1900 and the 1920s. At best, it had rather tenuous links with foreign missions, was autonomous in operations, and truly indigenous in ideas and leadership. It is a diverse sector made up of a combination of organized church groups, some nationwide with hundreds of congregations, and of individual congregations or even individual Christian workers who made their mark in a more local setting. Some of these coexisted with and interacted with the mission churches, others were quite separatist and had almost no contacts with other Christians, Chinese or foreign. Some of its major components were the following. 1. Church federations made up of self-supporting and self-governing congregations which had broken away or distanced themselves from foreign missionary bodies. One of these, the Chinese Christian Independent Church, had started as an independent all-Chinese congregation formed in Shanghai in 1906 by the Presbyterian pastor Yu Gozhen and others. By the 1920s, it had become a federation with over 100 affiliated congregations. A smaller North Chinese movement emerged in 1912 in Shandong. The Tianjin congregation of this federation was led by Zhang Boliang, 1876 through 1951, the founder of Nankai University. Cheng Jingyi, 1881 through 1939, who subsequently held important offices in the mainstream Sino-foreign Protestant establishment, was the leader of the Beijing Independent Church. 2. The True Jesus Church, a Pentecostal church founded in 1917 that may have been the largest of the independent groups nationwide by the 1930s. 3. The Assembly Hall, or Local Church, or Little Flock, organized in the mid-1920s and led by Ni Tosheng, Watchman Nee, 1903 through 72. This was a strongly proselytizing church and rather anti-foreign. 4. The Jesus Family, a unique Pentecostal communitarian church started by Jing Bianying, 1890 through 1953, in rural Shandong province in the 1920s. 5. Several other independent but more loosely organized groups, such as the Spiritual Gifts Church, which emerged as a revival movement in Shandong in the 1930s, as well as individual evangelists and teachers such as Wang Mingdao, 1900 through 91, famous for his conservative theological stance and outstanding moral rectitude, and the radical revivalist preacher Song Shengji, or John Sung, 1901 through 44. This concludes part 2.